Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to a next session of reading Rousseau's Social Contract. Um, Again, it's today we're looking. I see beard this time. Okay, it's been a couple days. It's been a while since I did the video, so we're going to return to it. Um, it's been nice to see you guys. Hope you, for you guys, it's not been a change, but for me, I took a week or two off. And I had no voice. You can hear still the voice squeaking a little bit, so it's like okay. Today we'll be we're finishing up book one, and we're going to be going to book one, chapter 5 through 9 of the social contract. Someone said maybe I should do smaller ones. Well, let's see how this works. Maybe I'll see what happens. So we'll start with chapter 5. Um, Again, let's go. I mean, I just want to go here for a second so you know what. Uh, Notes. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, I went too far. No, okay, right. Again, the question here is inquiring how man passed from the state of nature to civil society and what are the conditions of compact are. That's the whole point of this first book. So we went through here already. Now we went through chapter 4, and then we talked about now we're going in chapter 5 and chapter 5 through 9. Chapter 5 is that it is always necessary to go back to the first convention. Now, convention here means the first word convention means at one level it's the conventional, right? What is the norm or something we do to something here, but also it means to the start of a thing. The convention is the place of meeting, the place we have the word convention center, right? Convention, where you come together. That's what. See, convention can mean in the sense of describing our norms, habits, conventional, right? The typical normal thing, right? But he's not using that word like this way. He is meaning back. Well, yes, you can say the first conventions, right? But he means also here in the sense the gathering, right? To play a convention where we gather together and to form what is the city or the social. So therefore, okay. So he says we have to go back to the origins of the thing, right? So let's do this. Even if I were to grant everything thus have I have thus far refuted, the proponents of despotism would be no better off, right? That's his whole line about this. Even if I grant everything you said about there, no, you still be no better off. There will always be a great difference between subjugating a multitude and governing a society. Now, this is why again, this is interesting that he uses the word societas, society in French, and not other words. So therefore, there's a whole discussion about this. I kind of dealt with this in other videos, society versus community, and like this, and the meaning of this, and the origins of this. But there's a difference between subjugating a multitude. Like the idea here is that there's a difference between subjugating and treating people like slaves versus governing a society. If scattered men, however many they may be, are successfully enslaved by one individual, I see only a master and a slave. I do not see a people and its leader. Okay, this is very important. In other words, you see master and slave, not, in other words, I see subjugated people like this. This doesn't really create a people. Subjugation does not create a people, his point is. It's an aggregation, if you wish, but not an association. And I think this is an important word. Association in French, association here means association. And this is the word, and this is where you get in association, you get this ascension of the Greek word koinonia, which means a bond that holds us together, the thing that unites us. In other words, an associate. This is why Tocqueville uses this word association also. Association is very interesting from the French word because this is a bridge word between what the Germans would differentiate between in fact, association also is a weird word because it also can mean businesses, corporations, which in a way, now this is, I would say, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft problem in German, right? This is the community society problem. This is the communitas versus societas, right? Um, issue as well. That association is it's kind of something. Association is this thing that ties people together, interaction, right? It has neither public good nor body politics. So a mere aggregation. This is a very interesting point. And this is what distinguish. I think Rousseau would argue this is what distinguishes economic contract from either subjugation or economic activity would be distinguished in that they don't share a real common good. The aggregations. Okay, you can have a master subjugating, and there's an aggregation of people. It's not an association. The question is that in, let's say, economic activity, when does an economic activity shift from a quote unquote aggregation of people's private trade interests to an association? That's okay. That's a little thought experiment there. That man, even if he had enslaved half the world, is nothing but a private individual. His And that's right. This idea, this is something that Weber will talk about. This idea that this older world, this idea of this, that it's proprietorial, mine, private individual, and everything is mine, my property, me. There's not a civic or shared sense, right? There's no body politic in the sense. There's no public good. There's nothing but a private individual. His interest, separated from that of the others, is still nothing but a private interest, right? This is the parochial character of the. We can even say of This is the critique of, let's say, a feudalism of the feudal world, of the baron and lord. The problem with this is that the baron and lord also saw himself. It was always complicated by the Christian theology and the Christian understanding differentiated this in a certain way. And if we only still understood this materialistically and understood it proprietorially in terms of property and in terms of my ownership, then yes, Rousseau is right here on this point. Um, uh, and if the same man dies, therefore his empire is left scattered without bonds. Just as an oak tree degenerates and falls into a heap of ashes after fire has consumed it. A people, says Grotius, can give itself to a king. According to Grotius, a people is therefore a people before it gives itself to a king. Now, this is interesting. This is you. In the previous chapters, he's mocked Grotius. Therefore, we're assuming that he's always going to be against Grotius. He defended mastery. We talked about that earlier. We argued that no, Grotius doesn't do that. See, Rousseau plays with us as a reader. He will then at one hand use it kind of in a way to attack Grotius, but then here he kind of uses Grotius to advance a point, right? That it can give it, but it's a people before it gives itself to a king. This gift itself is a civil act. It presupposes a public deliberation. Therefore, before examining the act by which a people elects a king, it would be well to examine the act by which a people becomes a people. This idea of the creation of the social bond. How does a people become a people? How does a people become a people? In other words, the question is that yes, a people can give itself to a king, but okay, this is another point. But can a king create a people? See, Rousseau denies this. Grotius and Montesquieu might argue that okay, we can maybe create a people by it's not a people yet, but you can forge a people. But Rousseau doesn't want to say this. Rousseau wants to take this argument that there needs to be a people first before there can be a government. So, and here, I think this is where he is Montesquieuan in this sense. There needs to be a people first before there can be a government or a political, a formal political rule king or something like that. In other words, act by which a people becomes a people. For this act being necessary prior to the other is the true basis of society. In other words, the formation of a people becoming a people. This is Rousseau's basic right. This is the necessary act. Now we have to remember, the people becoming a people is still putting on chains. You cannot escape the chains. The chains, man in the state of nature, man, natural man, is totally free in this sense. But social man is not. He's bound. He's interconnected. And this is the point about this. Now let's continue. Indeed, if there were no prior conventions, what would become what would become of the obligation for a minority to submit to the choice of the majority, unless the election were unanimous, right? Unless what is the in other words, let's say convention is a private convention where there's some kind of rule, some kind of dominant. It's a prior convention, an agreement. A convention can also mean agreement in this sense, right? A prior convention that would become obligation for the minority to submit to a majority unless the election was unanimous. And where do the 100 who want a master get the right to vote for the 10 who do not? And where do the 100 who want a master get the right to vote for the 10 who do not? Right? This is this idea that the law of majority rule is itself an establishment of a convention and presupposes unanimity at least once. In other words, even the majority rule principle requires that there was agreement that we all agree to this at the beginning, unanimity. Okay, this is the idea. This is the formation of the social contract in that sense, or at least the foundation of it. That we see each other, we become a people. We are no longer disassociated individuals. We see each other as together as one. Right. This is his point here. And therefore, where do the 100 who want a master get the right to vote for the 10 who do not? Right. Therefore, this is the question. And that is only right is when what? When we've convinced that the majority should rule. Okay. So in chapter 6 on the social compact, I mean that men have reached the point where obstacles to their self-preservation in the state of nature prevailed by their resistance over the forces of each individual can use to maintain himself in that condition, that state, right? That condition. In other words, that man nature prevailed by their resistance over the forces of that. Then that primitive condition, state, can no longer subsist, and the human race would perish if it did not change its way of life. So, in other words, in nature, if man does not transform in this earliest state, the obstacles in these things, all the things in the state of nature, this condition of nature, leads to a situation where the human race would perish if it did not change its way of life. Now he says, second paragraph. Now, since men cannot engender new forces, but in other words, this is interesting. Men cannot engender new forces, but merely unite and form by aggregation a sum of forces that can prevail over. Okay, we're going to have a weird. Let's change that a little bit. A sum of forces that prevails over resistance, set them to work by a single motivation, and make them act in concert. So, therefore, in other words, man cannot. He's saying here that cannot engender new forces. Now, what is this? This is interesting. What does he mean by this? This is something, but new abilities, new capacities to do things. That they have the capacity to act, they have the capacity to do certain things, but there's limits to what they can do. They can unite. They can't conquer, they can unite, right? And by uniting, right, and no other means of self-preservation except to form by aggregation all their existing forces, a sum of forces that can prevail over the resistance. By nature, okay, this is set them to work for a single motivation, that is preservation, right? and to get them to act in concert. This sum of forces can arise only from the cooperation of many. Okay, so therefore they become cooperative. They are sharing a common interest, their survival, their preservation, and by cooperating, they are able to achieve that. But since each man's force and freedom are the primary instruments of his self-preservation, how is he to engage them without harming himself and without neglecting the cares he owes to himself? So how can he do that? How can he engage this cooperation without harming himself and the care he owes himself? In the context of my subject, this difficulty can be stated in these terms, right? Find a form of association that defends and protects the person and goods of each associate, while all the common force, with all the common force, and by means of which each one, uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself and remains free as before. This is the fundamental problem which is solved by the social contract. Okay, this is this quote he has, right? Finding a form of associate defends and protects the person and each good of each associate with all the common force, and by the means of which each one, uniting with all, together collectively, nevertheless obeys himself. It means self-ruling, self-governing, and remains as free as before. In other words, he's not less free. The clauses of this contract are so completely determined by the nature of the act that the slightest modification would render them null and void. So therefore, this agreement here is such that any real slightest modification would make them null and void. So, as although they may never have been formally pronounced, they are everywhere the same, everywhere tacitly accepted and recognized, until the social compact is violated, at which point each man recovers his original rights and resumes his natural freedom, thereby losing the conventional freedom for which he announced it. So therefore, this is this idea. In other words, again, this is a very interesting argument he's saying, is that this is all tacit. The creation of this is a tacit. It's not really a kind of binding legal things. We're, and often is he says that and I think this is where he kind of accepts Locke's modification of Hobbes, right? This Locke's tacit consent, right? Where everything tacitly accepted and recognized until the social agreement that everyone bonded by was violated, at which then everyone reverts back to rights. In other words, Rousseau's position is kind of Lobs and Hobbes, but at the same time much more fluid, because when it is violated, each man recovers the original freedom, thereby losing the conventional freedom which he announced. But going back to natural freedom, that's not that there's a problem with that. Each man buys himself. Properly understood, all of these clauses come down to a single one, namely the total alienization of each associate with all his rights to the whole community. So, in other words, surrendering. In other words, this is the alienation. In fact, this is the legal word to alienate, to give away. To alienate is to transfer. This is illegal. The language of Roman. This is even common law too. Property has to be alienated from its person, right? So this idea of total alienation of each associate with all his rights to the whole community. For first of all, each one gives his entire self. The condition is equal for everyone. And since the condition is equal for everyone, no one has an interest in making it burdensome for the others. Again, this is that everyone is in there. They say everyone's surrendering everything to it. This is the formation of the social bond that comes to people in that sense. Furthermore, as the alienization is made without reservation, the union is as perfect as it can be, and no associate has anything further to claim, right? For if some rights were left to private individuals, there would be no there'd be no common superior whom could judge between them and the public. In other words, if some fundamental rights were left that I can say myself, this is the difference between Rousseau and that sense, that everything has to become public right in that sense. That you have to forego natural right in this sense, because if you retain natural right, then there can be no judge. There is no judge in Rousseau's view. Um, for if there are some rights were left to private individuals, now this is, oh my God, this is communism. Yeah, it's no. It means something different. It's by private right, he means the claim of by right here in terms of a claim that it's mine and only mine, and no one else has a right to judge it. It comes from the Hobbesian understanding of the idea of the willing agent and has a right to do what he wills, or a right to what he wants and what he, in other words, he wants, he desires what he wants. That's the Hobbesian state of nature in that sense. That we have radical freedom is our free will has the right to want what we want, and we have a right to do so, and to and only our limitation in nature is we're limited by our ability to achieve what we want. Um, and everyone's right is their right. Therefore, this leads to the conflict because we both want if people want the same thing, or I want to do something. If I want something that is no, it's not a question I should want it or not want it. I want it, and you don't want me to want it, or because it harms you. My want of it harms you, either physically or economically or somehow. This leads to conflict, right? This leads to the war of all against all, right? And therefore, to solve that dispute, make sure that all right is social right in that sense. This is what he's trying to argue here in that sense. Each there can be no common superior if private right. In other words, if things were private individuals, if right was left to private individuals. This is why everyone has to be under the law. Everyone has to be under the law, under the rules. No one has to be above the law or beyond the law in that sense, right? Because there would be no common superior from who could judge between them and the public, right? This is the problem of the great, right? Each man being his own judge on some point would soon claim to be so in all. The state of nature would subsist in the association where necessity become tyrannical or ineffectual. So therefore, in other words, once you don't have a situation where all is bound by it, all is subjected to it, and that people retain their right to claim what they want and are outside, and that right remains outside, and that the social has no right to claim or judge it, this leads to a situation where this association would necessarily become tyrannical or ineffectual. I think finally, as each gives himself to all, he gives himself to no one. And since there is no associate over whom one does not achieve the same right, one grants him over oneself. One gains the equivalent of everything one loses, and the more force to prevent what one has. In other words, by giving everything over, he says, by giving the authority to do what I want. This is my private will. This is my right to do whatever I want in Hobbes. Okay, and you have to understand it. And I think the danger here is if you understand this too broadly. If you understand this too broadly, this appears totalitarian. I can see why there's critics of this. Oh my God, this is why I call it the Ayn Randers of the world, or that whole objectivist approach sees that was always, oh my God, he's a totalitarian. No, Hobbes is a totalitarian then too, but Hobbes is, oh my God, but Hobbes is also a liberal. This is the liberal state. This is the liberalism that Rand wants to, even people like Rand wants to have, because you can't. The individual is not the individual by themselves would be at powerless. This is what's wrong with anarchistic thinking. Anarchistic situation is that individuals are powerless ultimately, without society in that sense. They have nothing. They can only truly exist within a social network and flourish through a social network. This idea that man can be an item and I can live alone, I can live alone out in the world by my lonesome. Well, no, you go mad. So he says, in other words, over himself, one gains the equivalent of everything he lost, right? And then and more force to preserve what he has. In other words, he's not lost anything by doing this, by giving himself over to the association. Everyone does this, so that there's no one who's not losing anything more. What one has the same rights one grants over himself, right? One grants equivalence of everything he loses, and also gets more force to preserve what he has. And then everything that is not, and if then everything that is not the essence of social compact is set aside. So therefore, one can find that it can be reduced to the following terms. So if you just take everything, let's just set everything that's not dealing with what is we mean here by the social compact aside, right? Each of us puts his person and his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. By the general will is that it's by the will generale, right? This does not mean there's a spirit, super spirit. You create the super leader. Blah, blah. No, 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 no. It is that each one of individuals will. What we did was when we created this agreement that everyone by general he means the will of all, right? Um, and in a body, we received each member as an indivisible part of the whole. So therefore, this is how we create the whole. This is the creation of a people. Creation, and this is the thing. This is the problem in this because he is as individualistic. His account is as individualistic as Hobbes. He has no. In other words, this is his idea is that it is through individuals, through their individual will, we create the social will. Okay, remember that this is Rousseau is as and that it's his what he talks about the general will here is nothing more than the creation of the sovereign will in Hobbes, right? Which is created by the collective. We all agree to this. This is sovereignty in that sense. And instantly, in place of the private persons of each contracting party, this act of association produces a moral and collective body composed of as many members as their voices in the assembly, which receives from the same act of unity its common self, its life, its will. So, in other words, this is pure Hobbes. This is pure Hobbes. This is pure Hobbes. The first part one of the volume, part one of Leviathan. Book one of Leviathan. Right. This whole point about this. Right. Part one or something. That book, but this public person formed thus by the union of all others, formally to the name of the city. Right. This idea. This is where he wants to say that he's kind of rechanging things now. This isn't a whole argument. Is this really is what we're so honest here? And here again, he's Hobbesian. He's being he's making he's giving that even the origin of the city, the polis, of the political world, is the same as the state. This is an innovation. Aristotle say, ho ho ho. No, you're distorting me a little bit. Okay, so Machiavelli wants to break with agents. Hobbes wants to break with Aristotle. Rousseau wants us to forget the break and to think that this is all connected always. Okay. So the union of others formerly took the name of a city and now takes that of republic or body politic, which its members call state when it is passive, sovereign when it's active, power when comparing it to similar bodies. So, whoa, right there. This is like almost introduction of Leviathan, right? This is straight out of the the preface of Leviathan. Let's go look. Second paragraph, right? It's that first paragraph. Yeah, first paragraph of Leviathan. Uh, Maybe I should have it up there, but first paragraph of Leviathan. He says, but he talks about art, art goes further, imitating the rational and sexual works of nature of man. For art has created a great Leviathan called a commonwealth or state, in Latin civitas. Okay, Latin. He talks about Latin. He doesn't talk about the Greek, right? Polis and the city. He says civitas, which is but an artificial man, though greater in stature and strength, and for whom protection and defense it is intended, of in which it is which the sovereignty is the artificial soul, as in given life and motion to the whole body, the mat straits. In other words, again, he goes right into this wonderful paragraph of the first paragraph, and which basically spells out in the introduction the whole argument of Leviathan, right? Well, here Rousseau is kind of flushing that same logic out, but altering it. He wants to basically where Hobbes doesn't really mention the polis, the city in that sense, but takes civitas, right, the Latin word, and the state is that entity, the body. Now Rousseau wants to call it he wants to make the body politic, the city, right, the body politic, Rousseau, he would call Leviathan or the Commonwealth, right? The Commonwealth, or here's the city, right? Okay, this is the correction here. The true meaning of this word has been almost lost in meeting modern men. Most of them mistake the town for a city and a bourgeois for a citizen. They do not know that houses make the town, but that citizens make the city. Right? The same error has been. The same error was very costly to the Carthaginians long ago. I have not read that the title civis has ever been given to the subject of any prince, even in ancient times to the Macedonians or currently to the English, though they are closer to freedom than all the others. Okay, right? This is the English are closer to freedom than all the others. Only the French use the name citizen with complete familiarity because they have no true idea of its meaning, as can be seen from their dictionaries. If this were not the case, and in usurping it, they would be guilty of the crime of high treason. For the French, thus, for the French, this name expresses a virtue, not a right. Right? Again, this is a virtue. When Bodin wanted to talk about our citizens and bourgeois, he made a gross blunder in taking the one for the other. Monsieur D'Amble did not confuse them, and in his article in Geneva carefully distinguished the four orders of men, five counting the simple foreigners, who are in our town, and of whom only two compose the Republic. No other French author, to my knowledge, has understood the true meaning of the word citizen. So we have the understanding of what this word means here, right? This idea of this thing. So, and therefore, what he says that now that takes the republic, the city, and now takes that of republic and body politic, right? Um, uh, and we call this thing, and its passive thing, the state. When it's active, the sovereign. Power when comparing it to similar bodies, right? As for the associates, they are collectively called, take the name the people. And individually, they're called citizens as participants in the sovereign authority, and subjects as subject to the laws of the state. So therefore, that's interesting. If you're subject to the laws of the state, if you're a citizen, if you're as participant in the sovereign authority. So the people are those who collectively, the people, the associates who form the body politic are the people. If they partake in the sovereign, if they participate in the sovereign authority, they're citizens. So not every people, one who's a person is a citizen in this sense. Only if you are, in other words, this is the problem. Citizenship means being one who decides. You are part of the sovereign ruling authority. You're not, if you don't have a part in that sovereign ruling authority, you're not a citizen. You're only subject to the laws. But these terms are often mixed up and mistaken for each other, particularly citizen and subject, right? It is enough to know how to distinguish them when they are used distinguish them when they are used with complete precision. So therefore, he's trying to give you complete precision. Chapter 7 on the sovereign. This formula shows that the act of association, including a reciprocal engagement between the public and private individuals, and that each individual contracting with himself, so to speak, finds that he is doubly engaged, namely towards private individuals as members of the sovereign and towards the sovereign as members of the state. So therefore, this double entity, this top agreement, that there's the collective thing that creates there, but even then we are doubled, where we have contracts, we have agreements, associations between individuals, but we also have a kind of a reciprocal engagement between the whole, the part and the whole, right? The individual and the whole, the state, as a member of the state. I'm a member of the sovereign, individuals as members of the sovereign, and towards the sovereign as members of the state. But the maximum civil right, that no one can be held responsible for engagements towards himself cannot be applied here. This idea that in other words, a maximum civil right, that no one can be held responsible for engagements towards himself, right, cannot be respond here because there is a great difference between being obliged to oneself or to a whole which acts to or to a whole of which one is a part. In other words, this is a great difference between this. That one, a difference between it being obliged to oneself, that you are obliged to oneself, versus a whole of which one is a part. Big difference. And this is the difference between an organic structure and a social structure. I think that Rousseau is trying to say here in his expressed way that it's not the same as an organism. We're not organic in the sense. There's an obligation that is tied here in the organic sense. That is not necessarily in the social sense. That we're a part in a whole. I say, but isn't a body part a whole? Like, this is the problem. But obligated. There's a great difference between being obligated to oneself. To oneself, obligated in that sense that you must obey. And this is probably would need some reflection and correction in that sense. And maybe looking at the French would help, but this is beyond our tactic. Maybe this is always the problem with Rousseau in that sense. This is why some of the different translations is useful to go look at. Next, it must further be noted that the public deliberation that can oblige all of the subjects to the sovereign, due to two different relationships in which each of them is considered, cannot for opposite reason oblige the sovereign towards itself. So in other words, this idea of the sovereign is not obliged towards the sovereign itself. In other words, the true obligation is what I am to. My obligation is, what is this line? He says up here: doubly engaged, named private individuals members of the sovereign towards the sovereign as a member of towards the sovereign as a member of state. So I am what that each individual contracting with himself is, so to speak, finds himself doubly engaged, namely towards private individuals as members of a sovereign. So therefore, everyone is like this, agreed to this whole, and then what that every sovereign and of the sovereign and towards the sovereign as a member of the state. Reciprocal engagement between public and private individuals, right? And each individual contracting with himself, so to speak, finds this double engage. This is very complicated in that sense. The language here is really frustrating. Um, and that's the French in that sense. The French is very frustrating in that sense. Um, it we talked about this, right? It must be further noted that the public deliberation can oblige ones to, all of the subjects to the sovereign due to two different relationships, right? Each of them, which each of them is considered, cannot, for opposite reasons, obligate the sovereign towards itself, and that consequently, it is contrary to the nature of the body politic for the sovereign to impose on itself a law that it cannot break. So therefore, the sovereign is free. The sovereign exists within the free. There's no. The sovereign is free. There's nothing. In other words, there's nothing that is imposed upon the sovereign except that what we've agreed to, right? In other words, consequently, the nature of body politics for the sovereign to impose on itself a law that it cannot. So the sovereign cannot impose upon a law that itself cannot break. Since the sovereign can only be considered in a single relationship, then it is then the situation of a private individual contracting with himself. It is apparent from this that there is not and cannot be a kind of fundamental law that is obligatory for the body of the people, not even the social contract. So this is very interesting. There's no fundamental law that can be arbitrary on the people. People are free. There's no outside law, no outside obligation. No, they can only they say that only that they can contract themselves. They are free to. This is again. This is the will. This is we get. This is we can see this. We can see here the beginning of Kant, the idea of the radically free will in Kant, and we see this also from Descartes, the radical free, but never the political dimension as clearly as this point here. So it's not even the social contract is that fundamental law. It's we've come to agreement. This does not mean that the body cannot perfectly well enter an engagement towards another with respect to things that do not violate this contract. In other words, you can make an agreement. There can be agreements. We can agree it, but there's nothing obligatory in that sense. We've agreed to it, and therefore we've 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 made a contract, made an agreement. For with reference to the foreigner, it becomes a simple being or individual. In other words, this is the state relationship, right? There's no higher state. There's no international law in this. There's no ultimate law guiding except the agreements we've come to agree upon as individual agents. But the body politics are sovereign, deriving its being solely from the sanctity of the contract, can never obligate itself, even towards another, to do anything that violates the original act, such as to alienate some part of itself or to subject itself to another sovereign. So, in other words, wait a minute, I can't subjugate it myself. I've created the sovereign. Remember, the sovereign is the collective of people. Now, the sovereign cannot subjugate it by itself. It violates this body politics. This argument that if you do and cannot do anything that violates the thing that gave it its power, what it is. But the sovereign is an aggregate entity created by the agreement of the people to in their bond, in their act of social, in the act of contracting, right? So it cannot impose something on itself, and by making itself subject to another sovereign, Rousseau argues that this is no, you can't do that because what does it? Uh, because he says what he says, to violate the act by which it exists would be to destroy itself, and whatever is nothing produces nothing. So it destroy itself, therefore it's nothing. It can't produce anything. So it cannot alienate even some part of itself or subject itself to another sovereign. That's right. As soon as this multitude is thus united in a body, one cannot harm one of the members without attacking the body, and it is even less possible to harm the body without the members feeling the effects. You attack one body, you attack the whole body. You attack this. Again, this is a weird argument. This is he's now created an organic metaphor. The metaphor is now an organic. You attack the part, you attack the body. You attack one individual who's attacking the body, you're attacking the whole. Thus, the duty and interest equally obligates the two contracting parties to mutual assistance, and the same men would seek to combine in this double relationship all the advantages that are dependent on it. Now, the sovereign, formed solely by private individuals composing it, does not and cannot have any interest contrary to theirs. So there, in other words, that the sovereign only has the interest of the members of it. It cannot have an alternative interest of it, right? Consequently, the sovereign power has no need of a guarantee towards the subjects because it is impossible for the body ever to want to harm all of its members. And we shall see later that it cannot harm any one of them as an individual. And I think this is where, again, he's accepting the Hobbesian logic of this idea that okay, once you do it, the state. But this is where I find Aristotle more convincing. Aristotle does not argue for a general will. Does not argue. Now we get this. There is a unity here that well, I'm gonna this thing, but this in that sense. This is why it's so frustrating in that sense. The sovereign, by his sole fact of being, is always what he ought to be. So therefore, this entity, he exists. He is the collective entity of the whole. He cannot harm the members in that sense. This assumes that there's not. Again, this is a metaphysical assumption. It's in other words, there's an ontology here that Aristotle would say, no. Yes, I understand what you're doing, but you're taking the metaphor to. This is the criticism of Plato. I remember Aristotle's criticisms of Plato that he makes the city one such that it's no longer a city. And this is by doing this, the will becomes one, and therefore the will can't harm itself. But the city is more diverse, and there can be a situation where that the people who are leaders may have different interests than those who are the rest of the society, other groups. And that might cause a situation of division, okay? In other words, that once you accept the Rousseauian thing, then to seek division is going to be a sickness. It's going to be something unacceptable. And therefore, the reaction toward it is going to be completely different than the Aristotelian understanding, the classical understanding that understands yes, it's an aggregated whole, but it's also differentiated whole, aggregate differentiated things. Therefore, they can have separate interests, and those separate interests can. And it's the goal. In other words, this assumes a unity automatically in the creation of the social contract. that Aristotle says no, it's never really there. You strive for it, and it requires lots of work to strive for it. Because if you don't work on it to create harmony and balance, what ends up happening is that the natural conditions of interest will lead to the division and the breakdown of the community. And therefore, Rousseau, following Hobbes, gives us a totally inverted situation where everything should just flow, and that it's some supernatural, okay, this is the. If you're going to, I'm reading too much into it. By the same, but the same is not true of the subjects in relation to the sovereign, which, despite the common interest, would have no guarantee of subjects' engagement if it did not find ways to be assured of their fidelity. So the sovereign, the collective is always a thing, but the individual is more suspect. He needs to be faithful. Well, okay, but isn't the sovereign really going to always be embodied by a group, individuals who are put there and like this? This is the problem. In other words, the systemic thinking of both Hobbes. Okay, Hobbes will. The argument is Hobbes will make impersonate into a king, right? But that's his simple solution. But that solution creates a distinction that Hobbes always says that there can be no disagreement, and therefore, this leads and it gives the once you personalize the sovereign the way Hobbes does, and I think he does that purposefully. Leviathan, he does that purposefully to kind of to make what he's doing appear more traditional monarchy, a traditional and acceptable to the monarchists, the divine right or kingers, and traditional people. He doesn't want to appeal to innovative, even though he is radically innovative here in this thing. And Rousseau is more innovative in that sense. Not many more innovative, but more radically consistent. He takes Hobbes to the the extreme of Hobbes' own logic. Indeed, each individual can, as a man, have a private will, contrary to and differing from the general will, as he will he as a citizen. His private interest can speak to him quite differently from the common interest, right? His absolute and natural independent existence can bring him to views what he owes the common cause as a free contribution, the loss of which will harm others less than its payment burdens him. And considering the moral person of the state as an imaginary being because it is not a man, he might wish to enjoy the rights of a citizen without fulfilling the obligations and duties of the subject. And injustice, whose spread would cause the ruin of the body politics. In other words, free rider. This is the free rider syndrome, right, in this paragraph here, this last part, right? That what happens is that, yes, we're private individuals. And really, it's not going to, his argument here is the loss of which harms others less than the payment burdens him. But considering the moral person of the state is an imaginary being and not a man, you might like to enjoy the benefits of this, but not pay the duties. And what this happens will ruin the body politic. Therefore, in order for the social compact not to be an effectual formula, it tacitly means everyone must agree to it by not actively but passive, include the following engagement, which alone can give force to the others. That whomsoever refuses to obey the general will shall be constrained to do so by the entire body, which means that which means only that he will be forced to be free. And this is that controversial claim. He's forced to be free. And I think that's this, but here this is what Rousseau is right at a level. But you take this too extreme, becomes totalitarian. The law, that we've agreed to a law. I must obey the law. We've agreed to a law. I must obey it. Now the argument is, well, what if it's unjust and it hurts my interest in the unjust? Then you have to use the legal means. You just can't disobey it. The argument here is that once you've created it, but see, the problem with this thinking is that once you're in the system, the private individual can never then claim that, wait a minute, you have to wage war with the system, and that's not going. There's no, and that's going to be unacceptable. This is going to be the breach of this, and this is why you must. This is why only the you can see the logic that this is where Weber will get the idea that this is the monopoly of force, that only the state has the right to force, to coercion. If individuals surrender, there's right to coercion. And if anyone tries to claim that right, they break the system. So therefore, if you've lost, you must agree. Whoever refuses to obey the general will, the law, the rule, shall be constrained to do so by the entire body. So this is again, this is the way you avoid free rider penalties. Think about the free rider syndrome on the bus, right? We have inspectors on the buses to make sure the people who are cheating get a huge punished, fined, get captured, and fined. This is the necessary means by which and this is by what he means forced to be free. Because they're free only in that they're being governed in the body politic, in that sense. But if we understand this in terms of the different understanding, that it seems totalitarian. If we're totally free, how can we be forced to be free? That means coercion. Well, the state has, this is what he's saying about the law, the nature of law and the nature of the state. Only the state has the right to use coercion. And the coercion here is to make sure we've kept our agreements. This whole clause here is about what has been said here about free riders. Therefore, to read this out of context distorts the meaning of what is being argued here. This is being raised here on this problem of people who benefit from the rules, benefit from the system, but don't want to do their duty to the system. Right? This would be the ruin of it. And that to avoid that, and again, he says that, right? For this thing not to be ineffectual, you need this to happen. You need to have the agreement of this. For this is the condition that by giving each citizen to the homeland guarantees him against all personal dependence, a condition that creates the integrity, not integrity, ingenuity, and functioning, the ingenuity and functioning of the political machine, so that and alone gives legitimacy to civil engagements, which without it would be absurd, tyrannical, and subject to the most extreme abuses. So therefore, we've agreed to this. The function of this is that this. In other words, it gives legitimacy to the situation. We've agreed to it. Therefore, we have to abide by it. A condition that creates the ingenuity and functioning of the machine, the political machine, alone gives it legitimacy to civil. The engagement is done because we've agreed to it. In other words, we've come to an agreement that the will has authorized it. Therefore, we have this legitimates those civil engagements, and without which everything would be private will, right? It would be tyrannical, it would be absurd, tyrannical, and subject to the most enormous abuses. Now, Chapter 8 on the civil state. This passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces a remarkable change in man. By substituting justice for instinct, in his behavior, for the instinct in his behavior, and giving his actions the morality they previously lacked. So, therefore, the natural man is simply instinctual. Instinctive. It is based on instinct of his behavior, and they, that in my needs, I just act on my needs, and it lacks morality. In other words, this idea of justice, that morality means justice. Remember from Hobbes that there's no justice in the state of nature in that sense. What we do is we substitute justice for instinct. So, in the creation of justice, the civil it creates justice, and therefore substitute justice for instinct. Only then, when the voice of duty replaces physical impulse and right replaces appetite, does man, whom until that time only considered himself, finds himself forced to act upon other principles and consult his reason before heeding his inclination. So, whoa, this is where this is Kant. This is where Kant will get it. Let's think about this now. Only when the voice of duty replaces physical impulses. What is duty? The moral, there's justice. This idea of justice that the common entity has created. That this idea of duty, that was this obligation that's posed upon us, replaces the physical impulses, and right of that the obligation here replaces appetite. He forced now is now man finds himself to force on things that allows him what to heed, to consult his reason before his inclinations. Although in this state he deprives himself of several advantages given to him by nature, he gains a great one. His faculties are exercised and developed. His ideas broadened, his feelings ennobled, his whole soul elevated to such a point that if the abuse of his new condition did not often degrade him beneath the condition he left, he ought ceaselessly to bless the happy moment that tore him from it forever, and that changed him from that stupid, limited animal into an intelligent being and man. This is an important clause. Man, the state of nature, is a stupid, limited animal. But the state of the civil society makes him an intelligent being and a man. Yes, he's lost stuff. Yes, there's chains, but what he's gained more than he's lost. Let us reduce the pros and cons to easily comparable terms. What man loses by the social contract is his natural freedom and his unlimited right to everything that tempts him and that he can get. What he gains is civil freedom and proprietorship of everything he possesses. And that's pure Hobbes, right? Right from Leviathan. In order not to be mistaken about these compensations, one must distinguish carefully between natural freedom, which is limited only by the force of the individual, and civil freedom, which is limited by the general will, the will of all, right? The general agreement, the sovereign agreement, right? And between possession, which is only the effect of force, or the right of the first occupant, and property, which can only be based on positive title. So, possession versus property. Possession is what? The effective force or right of the first occupant, and property, which can only be based on positive title, on civic right. There's no natural property, therefore. There's natural possession, but there's not natural property. This is why there's the funny law in the English language. Possession is 9/10 of the law. And that's very Lockean then. In other words, that would be that's the Anglo-American thing. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, that's a very, because the idea of possession is simply my exercising of will, or I'm there, I possess it. Right, property is when it's yours. It's by law, civil right. To the foregoing accusation of a to the foregoing acquisitions of the civil state, one could be added moral freedom. Right? In other words, to the civil state, moral freedom, which alone makes man truly master of himself. So there was a, once you understand the idea of the moral state, the civil state, and the body politic, you've entered from the state of nature to the state of civil society, the civil state. And moral freedom is in there, which man makes him truly master of himself. For the impulse of appetite alone is slavery. For the impulse of appetite alone is slavery. In obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself is freedom. So therefore, if I'm subject to my impulses and my desires, I'm not free. Very Platonic. This is the place where he sounds very Plato-y. That the slave is the one who's subjected to his own desires and taken over. In fact, the natural state of man and the state of nature is I want whatever I want. I want it. And therefore I'm dictated by my wants. Right. Therefore, he is a slave in that sense. This is the impulse of appetite alone is slavery for Rousseau. Very Platonic in that sense. In obedience to the law one prescribed for oneself, in other words, self-governing one. If I prescribe the law for myself and I comply by it. Obedience to the law one has prescribed for itself. This is freedom. That's a great line in that sense, right? But I have already said too much on this topic, and the philosophic meaning of the word freedom is not my subject here. In other words, he's not going to go. This is freedom. I want to go into freedom yet. I've already said too much on this topic because the meaning of this word freedom is not my subject here. In chapter 9, real estate, land, right? Land, real estate, right? The real estate. Each member of the community gives himself to it at the moment of his formation, of its formation. So therefore, this is where he used the word. This is where community. And I wish I had my Rousseau in French. Where's my French Rousseau? It's probably hiding someplace. Oh, because I think this is that word. This is why society, community is very interesting. This is, I think. I wonder. I think it is the community because I know Roger, translator here, the masters were very literal in translating, trying to keep the French and English words that they're close. So there's an English word that's being used that's close. That's why dissociation. This is why this has a very awkward feel sometimes. So each member of the community gives himself to it at the moment of his formation, just as he currently is. So that whatever how you are, right? You create that. How am I now when I create this body politic, this community, this place? Both himself and all his force, and body himself, but is all his power, his ability to do things, right? Which includes the goods he possesses. So he's possessing the goods. It is not that this act of it is not that by this act possession. It is not that by this act possession in changing hands changes its nature and becomes property in the hands of the sovereign. So it is not that by this act of possession in changing hands changes its nature and becomes property in the hands of the sovereign. But as the force of the city is incompatible greater than that of a private individual, public possession is by that very fact stronger and more irrevocable, without being more legitimate, at least as far as foreigners are concerned. So therefore, this idea here, outsiders are concerned. In other words, it's stronger. I'm not defending myself. It's not more legitimate. In other words, he's not saying that the question of property possession and property, It's distinguishing possession and property, right? What is by law in that sense, right? For with regard to its members, the state is master of all their goods through the social contract, which serves within the state as the basis of all right. In other words, they're the judge. They're the judge of what has been done. Agreement. But with regard to other powers, it is master only through the right of the first occupant, which it derives from the private individuals. Therefore, state. This is about states within, things between states. Now, the state determines all questions of ownership of property in turn inside of its body politic. In other words, the state is master of all their goods through the social contract, right, which serves within the state as the basis of all rights. But that is not. But between states, that's not the case, and it's therefore the worst of the first occupant, right? They're occupiers in that sense, right? The right of the first occupant, although more real than the right of the strongest, becomes a true right only after the establishment of the right of property. So every man naturally has a right to everything he needs. Okay, every man naturally has a right to everything he needs. But the positive act that makes him the proprietor of some good excludes him from all the rest. So he's the proprietor. The positive act that makes him the proprietor, owner of some good, excludes him from the other ones, right? Once his portion is designated, he should limit himself to it and no longer have any right to the community's goods, the largest good. That is why the right of the first occupant, so weak in the state of nature, is respectable to every civilized man. This right one respects not so much what belongs to others as what does not belong to oneself. So that's a very interesting point here. His argument here is the first right. This I have a right is not really the right of the strongest, but really it becomes a true right only because of the establishment of property, and property only establishes through the right of civil right. Every man has a right to whatever he needs, but to make it mine. But the positive act that makes his the proprietor of some goods, this is mine. Therefore, if those others are not mine, excludes these are no longer mine, right? And once his portion is designated, he should limit it to itself. That once we've agreed to it, and no longer has any right to the community, the larger goods, the communities. I have to look. Okay, I'm a little worried about that. I think there's a little glitch here. It's community of goods. I kind of looked at it. This is, I think, of goods. He made it possessive. It has any rights to the community of goods. Of goods. No longer has this right to. This is why the right of the first occupant is so weak in the state of nature. But in this right, one respects not so much what belongs to the others as what does not belong to oneself. In other words, this is mine. I respect what does not belong to myself. It's not so much that what belongs to others as what does not belong. Well, this is mine, and what's not mine is not my concern. I should not try to claim it in that sense. In general, the following conditions are necessary to authorize the right of the first inhabitant to any land whatsoever. First, that this land not yet be inhabited by anyone. Second, that one occupy only the amount needed to subsist. And third, that one take possession not by vain ceremony, but by labor and cultivation. and only the only sign of property that others respect in the absence of legal title. In other words, work, labor. Like again, this is very Locke. This is Locke. Second treatise. My labor does this. My labor does this. In other words, the occupancy first is that no one should inhabit it. Second is that I only need as I need. And third, not by some vain ceremony, but by labor and cultivation. Indeed, by granting the right of the first occupant to need and labor, hasn't hasn't it been extended as far as possible? Right. In other words, first question: by granting the right of occupancy to need and labor, hasn't it been extended as far as possible? It is impossible to establish limits. Uh, it is impossible to establish limits to this right. In other words, is it impossible to? No, is it by granting the right to this by labor? Has it been extended as far as possible? That's first question. Second question is it impossible to establish limit to this right? Will setting foot on a piece of common ground be sufficient to claim on the spot to be its master? Right. That's the third question, and the fourth is will having the force to dispose others men for a moment be sufficient to take away forever their right to return? Very question. If I'm able to do this and then I kick you off and you have no right to return, right? This is a big question in politics and particularly international affairs, right? How can a man or a people seize an immense territory and deprive the whole human race of it except through punishable usurpation? Since this act takes away from the remaining men the dwelling places and food that nature gives them in common, right? That's the fifth question, right? So how can you do this? This come here and say this, I mine. It says, when Nunsbola, standing on the shore, took possession of the South Sea and all of South America in the name of the crown of Cartil, this was this enough to dispose all the inhabitants and exclude all the princes of the world? That's the sixth question, right? On the basis of such ceremonies multiplied rather ineffectually, and all the Catholic king had to do is take possession of the entire universe, all at once from his study, subsequently eliminating from his empire what had previously been possessed by other princes. In other words, this is very much, he's mocking him. In other words, he, he doesn't really answer the questions. He just raises these questions, and the implicit answer is no, right? No, 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 no. And this is basically his logic from these 3 points, right? This is saying his answer is implicitly that no, this is by granting this. Uh, uh, um, Indeed, by granting this, it hasn't been as far as possible. That's a question. Um, is these kind of questions about this release of the empire, right? It is understandable how the combined and continuous lands of private individuals become public territory, and how the right of sovereignty, extending from the subjects to the ground they occupy, comes to include both property and persons, which places those who possess the land in a great dependency and turns even their force into a guarantee of their loyalty. Right. This advantage does not appear to have been well understood by ancient kings who called themselves the king of the Persians, the Scythians, the Macedonians, seem to have considered themselves leaders of men rather than masters of the country. Today, kings more cleverly call themselves kings of France, Spain, and England, etc. By thus holding the land, they are quite sure to hold its inhabitants. So that the older kings did people, the modern kings controlled territories. And thus, by holding land, they're sure to host. What is extraordinary about this alienization is that far from plundering private individuals of their goods, by accepting them, uh, 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 by accepting them, the community thereby only assures them of legitimate possession, changing usurpation into true right and use into property. So What's extraordinary by this alienization is far from plundering private individuals of this, but it's by accepting them by accepting the community, thereby only assuring them a legitimate possession, changes usurpation in the true right and use in the property. Since the possessors are considered as trustees of the public good, and since their right are respected by all the members of the state and maintained with all its force against foreigners, through a transfer that is advantageous to the public and even more so to themselves. They have, so to speak, acquired all that they have given. This paradox is easily explained by the distinction between the rights of the sovereign and the proprietor to the same resource of the proprietor to the same resources, as will be seen hereafter. Right, so he's going to be saying that that this paradox we see here of the usurper of this and this transferring of this. This is again very frustrating and convoluted in that sense, because we look at this and we're saying, well, what's going on here? Why is this the way? Okay, let's continue. It can also happen that men start to unite before possessing anything, and that subsequently taking over a piece of land sufficient for all, they use it in common and divide it among themselves, either equally or according to proportions established by the sovereign. However this acquisition is made, the right of each private individual to his own resources is always subordinate to the community's right to all. So therefore, this without which there would be neither solidity, solidity in the social bond, nor real force in the exercise of sovereignty. Therefore, this idea of property, this land, this territory, this entity, this that we own collectively, that's the sovereign collects it in this idea. In other words, however the acquisition is made, the right of each private individual to his own resource is always subordinated to the community's own right of it. Because why? Because your right of it depends, and its surety of it depends on the community's entity. Without which there would be neither solidity in the social bond, with a social bond that ensures that every property is yours and like this, or real force in the exercise of sovereignty. There wouldn't be a sovereign, there wouldn't be no body holding up things. I shall end this chapter in this book with a comment that ought to serve as the basis of the whole social system. So he's going to end this chapter and the book on this comment that ought to serve as the basis of the whole social system. It is that rather than destroying natural equality, the fundamental compact, on the contrary, substitutes a moral and legitimate equality for whatever physical inequality nature may have placed between men. And that although they may be unequal in force or in the genius, they all become equal through convention and by right. So therefore, agreement and by right, convention by this. This is that equality. I think he means by this the equality of the law. In other words, that whatever inequality there is in physical inequality or moral, in other words, any physical equality they have, right? Or that unequal their power, or equal in their force or their genius. Right? A moral and a legitimate equality. They become equal through convention. Their equality is under the law. I think this is what he means by right, justice. They're all equal under the law. No one is above the law. No one is above justice. No one is above civil right in that sense. And the rules. I think this through convention and by right. This is what we would say in the rule of law. Convention here means, in that sense, the rules. The rules apply to all, and all are bound by them. And this is what I think Rousseau means by this. And this is how we should understand it. Not in the more extreme way that many people read it. Oh my, communism! We must submit ourselves to the general will that we destroy. No, he's not destroying the individual. The individual still exists here. But the individual only exists and secure in himself is in this social environment. Well, we're going to stop here, and I hope you have any questions or comments. Please put them below. Um, this is really worth doing. We will. If you liked what we did here, like it, like button, share it with social media, share it on your social media, share with a friend, get it this. If you've not subscribed, subscribe. Now, if you didn't like something, you can always say thumbs down, but say why in the comments and I will do it. If you have any comments, like I said, please put them, or questions, please put them there. When I see them, I will respond. If you want to follow me more on social media, the links are below. The links to them are below in that sense. You can go do that. You can also find my academic links to academic social media about my scholarship and my research, which is mostly Aristotle, yes, you're right. Um, and if you want to help, you can do so by, if you want to help to do what I do, you can do so by becoming a member of Subscribe Star Patreon. But you don't do okay. That's a whole spiel. I don't see my other, I just do hope maybe I'll get somebody to do something saying, I like what you're doing. Uh, yeah, I get, we see what happens. Another thing you can do is you can buy one of my books that are listed below. The link listed below, like this. Um, Again, this is Monday, the Rousseau stuff Monday, Wednesdays, and still, I think this is the Schmidt time, so you should be doing Schmidt on Tuesdays, Thursdays. Well, that's it. I hope you guys have a good day. Take care, and we'll see you next time. We'll start book 2 of Rousseau's Social Contract. See you. Bye bye.